We are all chasing a number, convinced that just a few more zeros in our bank account will finally unlock the door to freedom. Yet, the irony of the modern hustle is that the tighter we grip our wealth, the more it begins to own us. We find ourselves trapped in an invisible financial prison, shackled by the very resources we thought would set us free. Today, I am not going to teach you how to accumulate more. I am here to show you how to break the chains of material anxiety. We are exploring a profound 2,000-year-old letter from the Apostle Paul to Corinth, the wealthiest, most ambitious city of its time. This isn't just ancient scripture. It is a radical manifesto of financial freedom. Are you ready to stop surviving and start thriving by rebelling against the culture of scarcity? Let's uncover the revolutionary economics of 2 Corinthians. To truly understand the weight of Paul's words, we must first step into the dust and glory of the first-century Mediterranean world. This story is built upon a stark, almost cinematic contrast between 2 very different landscapes, the cosmopolitan powerhouse of Corinth and the battle-weary region of Macedonia. In many ways, Corinth was the New York City of its day, a glittering hub of commerce, culture, and cutthroat competition. Perched strategically between 2 major ports, it was a city where status was everything and self-sufficiency was the ultimate virtue. The Corinthians were the quintessential achievers. They had the best rhetoric, the most influential teachers, and a booming economy that made them feel invincible. For them, faith was often just another accessory to their success, a way to showcase their spiritual elite status. They were the ones who had made a grand promise to help the suffering church in Jerusalem, yet as time passed, their commitment withered. Why? Because wealth has a strange way of making us hesitate. When you have much to lose, every act of giving feels like a threat to your security. Now, look north toward Macedonia. If Corinth was the city of lights, Macedonia was a land of shadows. These people were living through what Paul describes as a great ordeal of affliction and extreme poverty. They weren't just struggling, they were being crushed by Roman taxation and social marginalization. Yet, in one of history's greatest ironies, it was from this place of absolute deficit that the most radical generosity was born. Paul observes that their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in a wealth of liberality. It makes no logical sense. In our modern economic models, 0 plus 0 cannot equal a surplus. But in the spiritual economy Paul is unveiling, the Macedonians discovered a secret that the wealthy Corinthians had missed. When you realize that your security isn't tied to your circumstances, you become dangerously free. The conflict here isn't just about money, it's a collision of 2 opposing spirits. On one side, you have the Corinthian spirit, the spirit of pride, calculation, and the meritocracy mentality of first-century Greece. They wanted to give, but only if it didn't disrupt their comfort or their carefully curated image. They viewed their resources as a shield to protect them from the world. On the other side, you have the Macedonian spirit, the spirit of surrender, urgency, and raw faith. These believers didn't just give what they could afford, they actually begged for the privilege to share in the service. Paul isn't just asking for a donation, he is holding up the Macedonian example as a mirror to the Corinthian soul. He is forcing these affluent believers to confront an uncomfortable truth, that their wealth had become their prison, while the Macedonians' poverty had become their platform for power. This is the stage upon which the rest of our story unfolds, a battle between those who have everything but are afraid to let go, and those who have nothing but have found everything worth giving. As we dive deeper into this letter, we must ask ourselves, which city do we truly live in? Are we guarding a fortress of self-interest in Corinth, or are we joining the radical, joyful rebellion in Macedonia? This brings us to one of the most intellectually jarring paradoxes in the entire biblical narrative, a concept that defies every law of modern sociology and every instinct of our survival-driven brains. Why is it that those with the least are often the ones who desire to give the most? In our contemporary American culture, we are conditioned to believe that generosity is a luxury reserved for the stable, the established, and the wealthy. We tell ourselves that we will become givers once we hit a certain salary bracket, once our 401 gaim is fortified, or once our mortgage is paid off. We view generosity as a byproduct of surplus, but Paul flips this logic entirely on its head, presenting the Macedonians not as people who gave despite their poverty, but as people whose generosity was actually fueled by their desperate circumstances. To understand this, we have to dismantle the scarcity mindset that dominates our lives. This mindset is a psychological trap that whispers that there is never enough time, never enough money, never enough security. Curiously, this trap is often most effective on those who have the most to lose. When you have a massive storehouse, your primary instinct is to build a taller fence. You become a slave to the maintenance of your own empire. The Macedonians, however, had no fences to build and no empire to protect. They were at the bottom, and in that place of absolute vulnerability, they discovered a terrifying kind of freedom. Paul explains that their abundance of joy met their extreme poverty, and the result was a chemical reaction of radical liberality. You see, when you are drowning in a sea of lack, you stop trying to save your own life and start looking for the person next to you who is also struggling. The Macedonians understood that since they couldn't find security in their bank accounts or their social status, they had to find it somewhere else. They found it in grace. In this context, grace wasn't just a theological term, it was an economic power. It was the realization that everything they had, even the meager crumbs in their hands, was a gift from a source that could never run dry. Because they believed the source was infinite, they didn't feel the need to hoard the finite. They saw giving not as a subtraction from their net worth, but as an addition to their spiritual capital. They weren't just donating, they were participating. Paul uses the word koinonia, which means fellowship or partnership. For the poor in Macedonia, giving was their way of saying, I am not a victim of my poverty. I am a partner in a global movement. This is a direct challenge to the American dream of self-reliance. We often think that by accumulating, we are becoming more powerful, more independent, and more secure. But Paul suggests that the opposite might be true. The more we accumulate, the more cluttered our souls become, making it harder for the current of grace to flow through us. The Macedonians were spiritually streamlined. Because their hands were empty, they were much quicker to open them. They didn't have to check with a board of directors or consult a financial advisor to see if they could afford to be kind. They simply saw a need and felt a holy compulsion to meet it. Paul notes that they gave beyond their means, a phrase that should haunt any modern person obsessed with living within their means. To give beyond your means is to make a statement that you are operating on a different set of books. It is a declaration of war against the fear of not having enough. When we look at the Macedonians through a modern lens, we realize that their desire to give was actually a survival mechanism for the soul. They knew that if they allowed their poverty to turn them inward, they would become bitter and broken. But by turning outward, they turned their poverty into a platform for purpose. They discovered that you don't need a surplus to have an impact. In fact, the most impactful gifts are often the ones that cost us our comfort. This is the Macedonian paradox. The less you hold on to, the more room you have for the kind of joy that the world can neither give nor take away. As we sit in our comfortable homes, scrolling through our accounts, we must ask, are we waiting for enough to start living, or will we follow the lead of those who had nothing and yet managed to enrich the world? The secret of 2 Corinthians is that the power of giving is available to everyone, regardless of their balance sheet, because true wealth is measured not by what you keep, but by the intensity of your desire to let go. This radical shift in perspective is the only thing that can truly break the walls of our financial prison. To truly grasp the revolutionary shift Paul is demanding from the Corinthians, we must look at the ancient theological foundation he invokes to dismantle their fear of loss. He reaches back centuries into Israel's desert wanderings to cite a peculiar phenomenon known as the Manna Principle. In his letter, Paul quotes a simple but staggering verse from the book of Exodus. The one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. At first glance, this sounds like a poetic call for social equity, but under the lens of spiritual economics, it is a devastating critique of the hoarding culture that defines much of our modern American life. To understand the Manna Principle is to understand the difference between a reservoir and a river, between stagnant wealth and the dynamic flow of grace. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, they had no means of production, no supply chains, and no safety nets. They were entirely dependent on a daily supernatural provision called manna that appeared on the ground every morning. The rules were simple, but counterintuitive. You gather exactly what you need for that day. If you were ambitious and tried to hoard extra, just in case if you tried to build a surplus, to buffer yourself against the uncertainty of tomorrow, something grotesque happened. The manna would rot and breed worms by nightfall. The message from the Creator was clear. Trust is not built on a stockpile. It is built on a relationship. The moment you try to turn a daily gift into a permanent possession, it becomes toxic. This is the heart of the Manna Principle. Provision is designed to be a flow, not a stagnant pool. In our contemporary American context, we are the champions of the hoarding mindset. We have been conditioned from birth to believe that the only way to be safe is to accumulate enough to never have to rely on anyone, including God, ever again. We build massive digital silos of wealth, convinced that the bigger the number, the smaller the anxiety. But Paul suggests that the opposite is true. When we hoard, we create a spiritual clog in the system. Hoarding is essentially a declaration of atheism. It is the silent belief that the source will eventually run dry, and therefore we must grab everything we can while it's available. This mindset creates a terminal soul, a place where resources go to die, buried under the weight of our own fear. Paul's vision for the church in Corinth, and for us today, is to transition from being terminals to becoming conduits. A conduit is a pipe. A pipe doesn't worry about whether it will have enough water for itself. Its entire purpose is to be the vessel through which the water reaches its destination. As long as the water is flowing through the pipe is always wet. It is always satisfied. The danger only arises when the pipe tries to cap itself off to keep the water for its own use. The moment the flow stops, the water becomes stagnant and the pipe becomes useless. Paul is teaching us that the abundance he promises isn't a reward for our hoarding. It is the result of our willingness to stay open. In the manna economy, the one who gathers much doesn't end up with a pile of rotted leftovers. They end up with the joy of seeing the little of their neighbor being filled to the brim. This brings us to the profound concept of equality mentioned in chapter 8. For a capitalist American audience, the word equality can sometimes trigger a fear of forced redistribution. But Paul isn't talking about a political system, he is talking about a spiritual ecosystem. He explains that your abundance right now is meant to supply someone else's need, so that at another time, their abundance might supply your need. This is the beauty of flow thinking. It recognizes that life is seasonal. Today you are the provider, tomorrow you may be the recipient. If everyone functions as a conduit, no one ever truly lacks, because the resources are always in motion. The manna is always fresh, because it is never allowed to sit still long enough to rot. Hoarding, by contrast, is an attempt to freeze time. It is an attempt to protect ourselves from the inherent vulnerability of being human. But in trying to protect ourselves from vulnerability, we also shut ourselves off from the miraculous. If the Israelites had successfully hoarded the manna, they would have never needed to look at the sky the next morning. They would have lost their connection to the giver. Paul is reminding the wealthy Corinthians and us that our surplus is not a trophy of our hard work. It is a seed intended for the next field. When we refuse to sow that seed because we want to keep it in the bag, we aren't being prudent, we are being fruitless. The ultimate takeaway of the Manna Principle is that enough is a spiritual state, not a mathematical one. The one who gathered little had no lack because their heart was aligned with the flow. They trusted that the sun would rise and the provision would be there. For the modern listener, this is the ultimate financial liberation. It means we can stop living in the rot of tomorrow's anxiety. We can begin to look at our bank accounts not as a measure of our worth or our safety, but as a measure of our capacity to bless. When we move from hoarding to flow, we find that the invisible financial prison we discussed earlier simply vanishes. We realize that the universe is not a place of scarcity, but a place of infinite supply, managed by a father who delights in seeing his children keep the resources moving. The question is no longer, how much can I keep, but how much can I channel? This is the secret to a wealth that never spoils, a wealth that is truly inflation-proof, because its value is found in the act of passing it on. We now arrive at the structural centerpiece of Paul's economic revelation, a concept so profound yet so simple that it has the power to completely reorient your financial life. In the 9th chapter of his letter, Paul introduces a strategic distinction that most modern consumers and even many financial experts completely overlook. He writes about the God who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food. Within this single sentence lies the master strategy of resource management. It is the distinction between what we are meant to consume and what we are meant to invest. For the modern American listener, caught in the relentless cycle of earning to spend and spending to live, understanding the difference between seed and bread is the first real step toward true wealth and spiritual authority. Let us begin by defining the bread. In the biblical metaphor, bread represents the portion of our resources intended for our immediate sustenance, our comfort, and our daily needs. It is the texture of our current existence. When you pay your mortgage, buy groceries for your family, or enjoy a meal out with friends, you are using the bread that has been provided for you. Paul does not condemn the bread. In fact, he acknowledges that it is a gift from a source of infinite supply. There is no shame in the bread. The bread is designed to satisfy the hunger of the present moment, to provide the energy we need to function, and to give us a sense of well-being. In our current economic language, bread is our operating expenses. It is the cost of living. However, the danger of our modern consumer culture is that we have been trained to view our entire income, every dollar that enters our bank account, as bread. We see 100% of our resources as something meant to be consumed, enjoyed, or saved for future consumption. This is the fundamental error that leads to the financial prison we discussed earlier. Now, let us look at the seed. The seed is qualitatively different from the bread. While the bread is for the mouth, the seed is for the field. The seed represents that portion of our resources that is not intended for our own consumption at all. It is the spiritual capital that has been entrusted to us for the purpose of being sown into the lives of others, into the kingdom of God, and into the needs of the world. In the agrarian world of the 1st century, every farmer knew that the most dangerous thing you could do was to eat your seed. If a farmer was hungry and decided to grind up his seed corn to make bread, he would satisfy his hunger for one night, but he would effectively be killing his future. He would be eating his harvest before it ever had a chance to grow. This is exactly what is happening in the average American household today. We are a nation of seed eaters. We take the portion of our resources that God intended for us to the portion meant to fund the mission of grace and to bless the broken, and we bake it into more bread for ourselves. We buy bigger houses, faster cars, and more expensive gadgets, all while wondering why we feel so financially tight and spiritually empty. The strategy Paul is presenting is one of holy discernment. He is calling the Corinthians to look at their surplus and ask a radical question: is this for my mouth, or is this for the soil? If you treat seed like bread, you waste your potential. If you treat bread like seed, you neglect your needs. But when you correctly identify the seed and it with a joyful heart, something miraculous begins to happen. Paul promises that the one who supplies the seed will not only increase your store of seed, but also enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. Notice the sequence. God doesn't just give you more bread to eat. He gives you more seed to The reward for being a faithful sower is the opportunity to geo on a larger scale. This is the multiplier effect of the kingdom economy. In the world system, if you have $10 and you give 5 away, you have 5 left. In Paul's system, when you geo that 5, you are initiating a cycle of supply that ensures you will have more to geo in the next season. This brings us to the psychological shift from being an owner to being a steward. An owner looks at his bank account and says, "How much of this belongs to me?" A steward looks at his bank account and says, "How much of this is bread for my family, and how much of this is seed for the world?" This shift removes the anxiety of giving. If you think you are an owner, giving feels like a loss. It feels like someone is taking a piece of your life. But if you know you are a steward, J-O, sowing, feels like an investment. You realize that the seed was never yours to keep in the first place. It was given to you specifically so that you could have the honor of planting it. There is a profound sense of dignity in being chosen as a conduit for God's generosity. You become a partner in the divine distribution system. For the American audience, this resonates with the principles of compounding interest and long-term investing, but with a supernatural twist. We understand that you have to defer gratification today to have wealth tomorrow. Paul is simply applying this to the realm of the Spirit. He is saying that the most secure investment you can make is not in a volatile stock market, but in the soil of human need and divine purpose. When you geo into the lives of the poor, or into the work of the gospel, you are placing your resources in a place where moth and rust do not destroy. You are converting temporary currency into eternal impact. But why is this so hard for us? It is hard because geo, sowing, requires an act of faith that eating bread does not. When you eat bread, the satisfaction is immediate. When you geo a seed, the seed disappears. It goes into the dark, cold ground. From a purely physical perspective, it looks like a loss. It looks like you are poorer than you were a moment ago. This is where the logic of the farmer must take over. The farmer doesn't stand over the field and cry because his seed is gone. He goes home and sleeps in peace because he knows the law of the harvest is at work. He knows that the soil and the sun and the rain will do what he cannot do. He knows that the one small seed will return to him as 100-fold stalks of grain. Paul's message to the wealthy city of Corinth and his message to us today, Lamotse thak thuk ve tum nin. He wants us to stop being short-sighted consumers who are only worried about our next meal. He wants us to become visionary sowers who see the harvest of righteousness that is possible when we stop eating our seed. Imagine the transformation in our communities, our churches, and our own souls if we began to manage our resources with this clarity. Imagine the freedom of knowing that your needs are covered by the bread of grace and your future is secured by the seed of generosity. This is the core of Paul's financial strategy. It is not about a percentage or a rule. It is about a relationship with the source. It is about trusting that if you are faithful to Geo, the seed he provides, he will make sure you never run out of either bread for your table or seed for your field. As you look at your finances this week, I invite you to perform a seed audit. Look past the bills and the debts and look for the seed. Find that portion that was meant for the field and dare to let it go. You will find that the moment the seed leaves your hand, it enters the hand of the one who can multiply it beyond your wildest imagination. This is the secret of the sower, and it is the only way to live a truly abundant life. In the heart of the modern American experience lies an unspoken religion, the religion of consumerism. It is a system built on a singular, insatiable creed that you are what you own, and that your value is inextricably linked to your capacity to acquire. From the neon lights of Times Square to the targeted algorithms on our smartphones, we are bombarded with a singular message: you are incomplete. This narrative suggests that peace, status, and security are always just one more purchase away. However, as we peel back the layers of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, we discover that his call to radical generosity is not merely a request for a charitable donation. It is a tactical manual for a spiritual insurgency. Paul is inviting us to participate in a holy rebellion against the very system that seeks to keep us enslaved to our own desires. For the modern listener, choosing to be generous in a culture of accumulation is the ultimate act of defiance. To understand this rebellion, we must recognize that consumerism functions through the engineering of discontent. It thrives on the scarcity mindset, the nagging fear that there will never be enough, and therefore we must grab, hoard, and protect. This mindset creates a spiritual gravity that pulls our hearts downward, tethering our identity to fluctuating markets and temporary possessions. When Paul writes to the affluent believers in Corinth, he isn't just asking them to balance a ledger, he is asking them to break the gravity of greed. He knows that as long as they are obsessed with their own comfort, they are effectively neutralized. By calling them to give and to give cheerfully, he is offering them a way to declare their independence from the empire of more. In this light, every act of giving becomes a no to the world's system and a resounding yes to the kingdom of God. It is a statement that your life is not defined by the brand you wear or the car you drive, but by the grace you distribute. This rebellion is particularly poignant for us in the United States, where our standard of living has often become a substitute for a quality of soul. We have been trained to believe that our security is found in the size of our barns, or in modern terms, the thickness of our investment portfolios. But Paul reminds us that the surplus we guard so fiercely is often the very thing that prevents us from experiencing the miraculous. When we choose to sow our resources into the lives of others, we are staging a protest against the idol of self-sufficiency. We are admitting that we are not the ultimate source of our own life. This is a terrifying prospect for the ego, which wants to be in total control. Yet, it is in this very surrender that we find our greatest strength. The super-apostles of Paul's day, much like the influencers of ours, touted power, wealth, and charisma as the marks of divine favor. Paul counters this by showing that true power is found in the weakness of a hand that refuses to clench into a fist. Furthermore, this rebellion redefines the concept of the American dream. If the traditional dream is about upward mobility and personal accumulation, Paul's Macedonian dream is about downward mobility and communal flourishing. He celebrates a group of people who found more joy in their extreme poverty than the Corinthians found in their wealth of resources. This is the ultimate subversion of consumerist logic. It suggests that the person who can give the most is actually the freest person in the room. When you give away what the world tells you to keep, you are breaking the invisible leash of the financial prison. You are proving that money does not have a grip on you. You are demonstrating that you serve a master whose resources are not subject to inflation, recession, or market crashes. Ultimately, the act of radical generosity is the only way to stay human in a machine-driven economy. Consumerism seeks to turn us into users, passive recipients of products and services. But Paul calls us to be sowers, active participants in the restoration of the world. A user is always hungry, always looking for the next fix. A sower is always hopeful, always looking for the next field. This shift in identity is the heart of the rebellion. As you walk through the aisles of your life this week, realize that every dollar you choose to release is a blow against the fortress of materialism. It is an act of spiritual warfare that clears the path for grace to flow. Paul's message is clear. Do not let the world squeeze you into its mold of consumption. Instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind into a conduit of blessing. By choosing the path of the cheerful giver, you aren't just helping someone else. You are leading a one-person revolution toward your own liberation. This is the beauty of the 2 Corinthians economy. The more you give away in defiance of the world, the more you receive of the things that the world can never buy. In every boardroom from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, the language of success is spoken through a single, uncompromising acronym, ROI. We are a nation of investors, meticulously calculating the return on every dollar spent, every hour sacrificed, and every risk taken. We live in a world where we are constantly reminded that our future security depends on our ability to outperform inflation and navigate the treacherous waters of market volatility. We look at our portfolios and see numbers that represent our hopes, our dreams, and our safety. But as Pseudo Paulo writes to the Corinthians, he invites us to consider a form of investment that operates on a completely different set of principles, a return on investment that is, quite literally, out of this world. He introduces us to a new metric for success, the harvest of righteousness. When Paul discusses the outcomes of radical generosity in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, he uses the Greek word dikaiosine, which we translate as righteousness. In our modern religious vocabulary, we often think of righteousness as a private, moral standing or a state of being good. But in the context of Paul's economic manifesto, righteousness is something far more tangible and enduring. It is a permanent spiritual asset. Paul quotes the Psalms, saying of the generous man, "His righteousness endures forever." Think about that for a moment in the context of your investment strategy. In a world where currencies can be devalued overnight and even the most stable governments can face bankruptcy, Paul is describing an asset class that is immune to the forces of time and decay. He is talking about an inflation-proof wealth. To the American mind, the idea of giving money away and calling it an investment seems like a linguistic trick. In our standard accounting, giving is an expense. It is a subtraction from the bottom line. But Paul suggests that when we give in alignment with the grace of God, we are actually performing a high-level currency conversion. We are taking unrighteous mammon, the temporary perishable currency of this world, and converting it into the eternal, imperishable currency of the kingdom of God. This is the ultimate hedge against market collapse. When you invest in a building, the building will eventually crumble. When you invest in a company, the company may eventually fail. But when you invest in righteousness, by meeting the needs of the broken, by fueling the mission of the gospel, and by living with an open hand, you are building a ledger that is backed by the full weight and glory of the Creator Himself. This is an ROI that does not depreciate. Rather, it compounds into eternity. Furthermore, Paul emphasizes that this new ROI isn't just about what happens after we die. He speaks of a present-day enrichment that defies logic. He tells the Corinthians that God will make them rich in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. Notice the circularity of this divine economy. The return on your investment of generosity is not just more money for your personal consumption that would be returning to the bread mindset. Instead, the return is an increased capacity for more generosity. God invests in those who have proven to be reliable conduits. If He can trust you to keep the resources moving, He will continue to replenish your supply of seed. This is the fiduciary responsibility of the believer, to manage the King's resources in a way that maximizes the harvest of grace in the world. For the modern listener, this requires a radical re-evaluation of what it means to be rich. In the world's eyes, wealth is measured by what you have accumulated and stored in your accounts. In Paul's eyes, wealth is measured by the size of the harvest you have initiated through your sowing. The person with millions in a bank account but no harvest of righteousness is, in the economy of heaven, devastatingly poor. Conversely, the person who has given away much and seen lives transformed, hearts healed, and the kingdom expanded is, by every eternal metric, a billionaire. This is the diversification strategy of the soul. We must stop putting all our trust in the perishable portfolio of this world and start allocating our lives toward the imperishable harvest. As we navigate an era of economic uncertainty, with fears of recession and the rising cost of living, Paul's words offer a profound sense of calm. He is reminding us that our true net worth is not determined by the Federal Reserve or the movements of the S&P 500. Our net worth is found in the righteousness that we have sown into the world. This is the only investment that is truly recession-proof. It is the only asset that you can take with you when you leave this life. By shifting our focus from the ROI of our bank accounts to the ROI of our righteousness, we find a freedom that no economic downturn can touch. We realize that the most profitable thing we can do with our lives is to give them away in the service of grace. This is the great conversion, and it is the invitation extended to every one of us today, to trade the temporary for the eternal, the fleeting for the forever, and to invest in a harvest that will never end. In our highly litigious and insurance-saturated society, the concept of loss is treated with visceral dread. We have built an entire culture around the mitigation of risk, convinced that the only way to survive is to build walls around our assets. We operate under a scarcity mindset, a persistent, whispering anxiety that there will never be quite enough to go around. This mindset tells us that every time we open our hands to give, we are diminishing our own security. But as we journey deeper into Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he invites us to abandon this defensive posture and adopt what we might call the logic of the farmer. This is a mental framework that replaces the fear of loss with the expectation of a harvest. To the modern urbanite, the act of sowing looks like a reckless waste of resources. Imagine a farmer standing on the edge of a vast, empty field. In his hands, he holds a bag of high-quality seed, the result of last year's hard work, and his primary source of future survival. If he follows the logic of scarcity, he will keep that bag tightly sealed. He will count the seeds, admire their potential, and store them in a secure vault, fearing that if he lets them go, they will be gone forever. To the untrained eye, sowing looks like throwing your food into the dirt. But if he does this, the seeds remain just that, seeds. They are safe, but they are sterile. The farmer, however, understands a fundamental law of the universe that the hoarder can never grasp. The only way to multiply a resource is to release it. He knows that the soil is not a grave for his seed, but a womb. When Paul tells the Corinthians that whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, he is not issuing a religious mandate. He is describing a biological reality. The farmer's logic dictates that the intensity of the sowing determines the magnitude of the reaping. If you want a bountiful return, you cannot be timid with your investment. This is where the American listener often recoils. We want the harvest, but we want to keep the seed too. We want the security of the bank account and the impact of the legacy simultaneously. Paul's message is a sobering reminder that you cannot have both. You must choose between the safety of the bag or the potential of the field. Breaking the scarcity mindset requires a profound act of trust in the unseen. Between the day of sowing and the day of reaping, there is a long, quiet season of waiting. During this time, the farmer has nothing to show for his sacrifice. His neighbors might look at his empty barn and mock his loss. But the farmer is not worried. He has aligned himself with a system that is older and more reliable than any stock exchange. He knows that the seed has been planted in good soil and that the one who provides the rain is faithful. For us today, adopting the logic of the farmer means reframing our financial life. Instead of looking at our charitable giving as a line item expense that reduces our net worth, we must begin to see it as a strategic deposit into an eternal field. We must realize that giving is not something we do after we are secure. It is the very process by which we become secure. It is the act of sowing that breaks the curse of fear. When you dare to throw your seed into the field of another person's need, you are declaring that you are no longer a slave to the scarcity mindset. You are stepping into a world of abundance where the only way to lose is to keep, and the only way to truly have is to let go. This is the quiet, revolutionary confidence of the farmer, a confidence that allows us to sleep in peace, knowing that our harvest is already on its way. In the final analysis of Paul's economic vision, we arrive at the most vital metric of all, the joy factor. Paul concludes his instruction with a directive that serves as the ultimate litmus test for spiritual and financial liberation. He writes that every person should give what they have decided in their heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. This is not a polite suggestion, it is a profound psychological diagnostic. If the act of releasing your resources is accompanied by a sense of grief, hesitation, or internal resentment, it is a clear signal that the invisible leash of wealth is still firmly around your neck. You are not yet free. True generosity is never a transaction of duty. It is an overflow of delight. The Greek word Paul uses for cheerful is hilaros, from which we get our English word hilarious. Imagine that, giving so freely that it becomes a source of contagious, light-hearted joy. In the American hustle, we are taught that joy comes from the get. We celebrate the closing of the deal, the arrival of the package, or the growth of the account. But Paul suggests that the highest form of human satisfaction is found in the release. When you can let go of a significant resource and feel a surge of hilarity rather than a pang of loss, you have achieved a level of wealth that no bank can offer. This joy is the proof that money has lost its power over your identity. It is the sound of the prison doors swinging open. A person who gives under compulsion is still a resident of Corinth, governed by social pressure and fear. But a person who gives with joy is a citizen of a higher economy, governed by the inexhaustible grace of the Father. This joy factor is the ultimate dividend of a life lived as a conduit. It is the peace that comes from knowing that your joy is not anchored in what you have kept, but in the beauty of what you have been able to set in motion. As we conclude this journey through the revolutionary economic landscape of 2 Corinthians, the question remains: will you continue to live as a prisoner of your own security, or will you step into the radical freedom of a sower? We have seen that wealth is not found in the stillness of a stagnant reservoir, but in the dynamic power of a flowing river. You now hold the master key to the manna economy, the understanding that your provision is guaranteed by the source and your purpose is found in the distribution. True abundance is not a destination you reach once your accounts are full. It is a lifestyle you adopt the moment you decide to stop eating your seed. So, here is my challenge to you. Do not wait for a windfall to become generous. Rebellion doesn't start with $1 million. It starts with a single, intentional act of letting go. This week, I invite you to perform a strategic release. Find a need that moves your heart, a neighbor struggling with bills, a mission, or a friend in crisis, and sow a portion of your resources into that soil. Do it not because you have to, but because you can. Experience the joy factor for yourself. As you open your hand, acknowledge the fear that tries to stop you, and then release it anyway. By doing so, you are declaring that money is no longer your master. You are walking out of the financial prison and into a life of purpose and peace. The harvest is waiting. It is time to plant.